boat had no flag. That was the first rule, and the most important one. On a dark night in 1964, off the coast of North Vietnam, a fast patrol boat with no markings and no national colors ran in toward the shore, carrying a crew that officially did not exist, sent by a command that officially did not exist, to do a job the government paying for it would deny under oath. The men aboard carried nothing that could be traced. No dog tags, no letters from home, no cigarettes with American labels. If they died as no one. If they were captured as ghosts. And the most powerful nation on earth would look the North Vietnamese in the eye and say it had never heard of them. Hanoi knew. That is the part people miss. The North Vietnamese were not fooled for a moment. They caught the men who came ashore. They put them in cells. They put some of them on trial and read out the charges to the world. And when their diplomats sat across the table from the Americans in the years that followed, they raised those raids and those commandos, and they demanded that the acts of war stop. But here is the thing they could never quite do. They could not demand that the unit be shut down, because the unit had a name so deliberately boring that saying it out loud told you nothing at all. Studies and Observations Group. Studies. Observations. It sounded like a room full of men with clipboards counting rice barges. It was in fact the largest and most secret unconventional warfare command the United States ran during the entire war. And its business was to send Americans and their allies across borders that America publicly insisted it was not crossing. So ask the obvious question. What happens when your enemy wants you to disband a unit that you have sworn to the world does not exist? And then ask the better question, the one this whole story turns on. What if the enemy was never the real threat to that unit's survival at all? Because the fight that nearly killed the Studies and Observations Group was not fought in Hanoi. It was fought in Washington. And the man caught in the middle of it commanded 500,000 American troops. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe. Because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. To understand why this command mattered enough to fight over, you have to understand what it actually did. And you have to start on the day it was born. The Studies and Observations Group came into being on the 24th of January, 1964. The war that most Americans would later picture, the one with 500,000 troops and B-52 strikes and the nightly body count, did not exist yet. What existed in early 1964 was a smaller, quieter, more deniable war, and this command was built to fight it. Its charter was covert action against North Vietnam and along the borders where the enemy moved. That charter had several parts, and each one was more sensitive than the last. There was a maritime program, fast boats hitting coastal targets in the north. There was an agent program, small teams inserted by boat and by parachute deep into North Vietnamese territory, to gather intelligence and, in theory, to build resistance. There was psychological warfare, fake radio stations and forged leaflets, and an entire invented resistance movement, designed to make Hanoi believe its own people were turning. And later, once the ground war exploded, there was the work the command became most known for, among the few who knew anything at all: cross-border reconnaissance. Small teams of Americans and indigenous fighters slipping into Laos and Cambodia to watch the trail the North used to move men and supplies south. The plan that governed the early operations against the North had a name: Operation Plan 34A, usually shortened to 34 Alpha. It launched in the first days of February 1964, and it is where the whole story tangles up with something most people have heard of, even if they have never heard of the men who caused it. In the summer of 1964, the maritime side of 34 Alpha ran a series of raids against targets on the North Vietnamese coast, including installations on offshore islands. At almost the same time, an American destroyer was conducting an electronic intelligence patrol in the same waters. The North Vietnamese, having just been raided by fast boats they could not officially blame on anyone, saw a warship off their coast, and drew the conclusion any military would draw. What followed became the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the event the Johnson administration used to justify the resolution that opened the door to full American escalation. The men in the fast boats never set out to widen the war. They helped start it anyway, and almost no one knew they were there. The agent program was, by almost any honest measure, a catastrophe. Team after team went into the North. Very few came back. The North Vietnamese security services were patient and thorough, and they did something worse than simply killing the men they caught. They turned them. A captured radio operator, worked on hard enough, could be made to keep transmitting. And on the other end, an American case officer would read the messages and believe a team was alive and operating, when in truth, it was sitting in a North Vietnamese prison, sending exactly what its captors wanted sent. For years, the command ran teams into a void, dropping more men to reinforce networks that existed only in the minds of the enemy officers running the deception. The men who went in were disowned the moment they were lost. Their families were told nothing true. Some of them sat in prison for a decade and more, and it would take until long after the war for a few of them to be acknowledged at all. That was the price of the fiction. If the unit did not exist, then neither did the men it lost. You cannot mourn a ghost in public. There was also a piece of the operation that reads almost like satire, except that it was real and men's lives ran through it. Alongside the raids and the agent drops, the command invented an entire resistance movement inside North Vietnam and then worked to make Hanoi believe it was real. It had a name, the Sacred Sword of the Patriots League, and it had radio broadcasts, and printed materials, and a mythology, and not a single genuine member, because the whole thing was manufactured from nothing in an American planning office. To sell the fiction, the command ran a program that captured North Vietnamese fishermen at sea, brought them blindfolded to a base, dressed up to look like a hidden liberated zone controlled by this movement that did not exist, fed them well, treated them kindly, filled their heads with the story, and then returned them home to spread the word of a rebellion that was pure invention. Some of those fishermen went home genuinely convinced they had spent a few weeks among free North Vietnamese patriots. They had in fact spent a few weeks as the audience for an elaborate piece of theater staged by a command whose name, when anyone said it, was Studies and Observations Group. All of this fell under one headquarters, the one run by the American general in charge of the whole war effort in South Vietnam. From the middle of 1964 to the middle of 1968, that general was William Westmoreland. The Studies and Observations Group was his to answer for. It was not, as we will see, entirely his to control. Now hold the picture of that boat with no flag, because the flag matters more than any single raid. Every part of what this command did depended on one thing being true, or at least being sayable. The United States was not, officially, at war beyond the borders of South Vietnam. It was not bombing Laos. It was not sending men into Cambodia. It was not running commandos into the north. Laos and Cambodia were neutral countries by international agreement, and Washington had signed those agreements. To admit that American soldiers were operating on that ground would be to admit that the United States was violating treaties it had put its own name to, and it would hand Hanoi, Moscow, and Beijing a propaganda victory worth more than any bridge a recon team might find. So the denial was not a detail. The denial was the whole architecture. The boring name, the sterile equipment, the disowned prisoners. All of it existed to protect one sentence that American officials needed to be able to say with a straight face: "We are not there." This is why the idea of an enemy demand to disband the unit falls apart the moment you look at it. Hanoi could denounce the raids, and it did. Hanoi could parade captured commandos, and it did. Hanoi could sit at the table and demand an end to the acts of war being committed against it, and it did that too. What Hanoi could not do was force the Americans to disband a command by name, because the Americans would simply have blinked and asked, "Which command?" You cannot be made to cancel a thing you have already sworn does not exist. The secrecy that made the unit vulnerable in one way made it untouchable in another. No enemy could argue it out of existence, because to the world, it was already not there. Which raises the real question: if the enemy could not end it, who could? The answer to that is coming. But first, a word about the men this is actually about. The soldiers who ran these operations left almost nothing behind that you can point to. No campaign was named for them. For decades, their war was not even admitted to have happened. What they did was carry a rifle and a radio across a line their own government said they were not crossing, into ground where being captured meant being disowned by the country that sent them. That is a specific kind of service, done for no ceremony, and often for no acknowledgement at all. If a story like this is worth keeping in front of people, a like on this video is a small thing, and it keeps these histories visible for the people who have never heard them. For men who fought a war their own side would not admit to, it is close to the least that can be offered. The thing that could end the Studies and Observations Group, or cripple it, or keep it on a leash so short it could barely function, was not the North Vietnamese army. It was the government of the United States. To see why, follow the cross-border reconnaissance, because that is where the argument was sharpest. By 1965, the North was moving enormous quantities of men and supplies south through Laos and Cambodia, along the network the Americans called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The command wanted to put small teams on that ground, watch it, map it, call in airstrikes on it, and generally make the enemy pay a price for using supposedly neutral territory as a highway. Militarily, the case was obvious. The trail was killing Americans. The trail ran through Laos and Cambodia. Therefore, watch the trail where it ran. Politically, the case was a nightmare, and Washington treated it like one. The program that finally put ground teams into Laos had a code name, Shining Brass, and permission for it was fought over for months before it was granted. When it came wrapped in restrictions. There were limits on how deep the teams could go. There were limits on how many Americans could be on a team. There were zones that were open and zones that were closed, and rules about what could be struck and what could not. The men on the ground, and the officers who sent them, spent the war pressing against those limits, arguing that a leash that short made the whole effort close to pointless, asking for permission to go farther, stay longer, and hit harder. The code names themselves kept changing, Shining Brass becoming Prairie Fire when the old name leaked, which happened often enough to be its own quiet joke, a secret war whose secrets would not stay secret. Cambodia was the same argument in a harder key. The North used Cambodian territory as a sanctuary, staging areas and supply depots just across a border the enemy crossed freely, and the Americans, officially, did not. The command wanted to send teams there too, under a program that got its own name, Daniel Boone, to find the sanctuaries, and the caches, and the headquarters, that everyone knew were sitting a few miles inside a country the United States was not fighting in. Permission came, again grudgingly, again with restrictions, and again it became a running fight over how deep, how many, and how hard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The White House and the State Department pushed against every expansion, and their fear was not foolish. Every widening of the cross-border war carried the risk of widening the whole thing. Push too hard into Cambodia, and you might topple a neutral government into the enemy's arms. Go too far in Laos, and you might provoke a Chinese response. And the ghost that hung over every decision in that war was the memory of Korea, where Chinese armies had poured across a border and turned an almost won war into 3 more years of stalemate. So Washington held the reins tight, approved cross-border operations in pieces, and treated every request to expand them as a door that, once opened, might not close. This is where the real answer to the title lives. What Westmoreland actually did about the Studies and Observations Group was not to defend it from an enemy demand. It was to fight, again and again, on the American side of the argument, for the authority to use it. As the commander responsible for the whole war, he wanted the trail interdicted, he wanted the cross-border reconnaissance expanded, and he pushed Washington for the freedom to run the operations at a scale that might actually matter. He did not always win. The authority came in increments, loosened here, restricted there, granted for one border and withheld for another. The command survived and grew, not because an enemy failed to shut it down, but because the men above it in Washington could never quite decide whether it was too dangerous to expand or too useful to abandon, and so they kept it alive on a tight rein for years. The rein was tight, the cost was not. Whatever the politicians in Washington decided in any given month, the men on the team still had to go into the ground the arguments were about, and that ground was some of the most dangerous a soldier could walk. The enemy knew the trail was being watched, and hunted the teams that watched it. A reconnaissance team was small, a handful of Americans, and a handful of indigenous soldiers, dropped into territory thick with an enemy who wanted them dead, and who often outnumbered them by 100 to 1 or worse. The job was to see without being seen, and when that failed, which it often did, the job became to survive long enough for helicopters and aircraft to pull them out of a fight they could not win on the ground. By reputation, and the reputation is deserved, The reconnaissance work of this command carried some of the highest casualty rates of any American units in the war. Teams were wiped out. Men were lost and never recovered. Left on ground the United States was not admitting it had ever been on, which meant that even in death they were part of the fiction. A man killed in Laos could not be reported as killed in Laos. The war he died in was a war his country would not name. When a team was compromised, and compromise was often a matter of when and not if, survival came down to speed and to the men in the air. Helicopter crews flew into landing zones ringed by an enemy who had just found the team they were coming to save. Forward air controllers circled overhead, directing strikes so close to friendly positions that a small error would kill the men they were trying to protect. Fighter pilots rolled in on targets a few dozen meters from Americans on the ground. The extractions produced acts of courage that would have been headline news in any war the public was allowed to know about. Here they were filed away, classified, and left unspoken for decades, because the men being pulled out of those landing zones were being pulled out of countries the United States was not admitting it was in. Running underneath all of it was that early failure in the North. The agent teams captured and turned, sending their false messages back to men who wanted to believe them. It is one of the harder things in the whole story. The command was built on deniability, and deniability turned out to be a knife that cut both ways. It let the United States run a secret war. It also let the enemy run a secret deception inside that war. And it left the men who paid for both with no country willing to say their names out loud. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in that war, in special operations, in the aviation units that pulled teams out of impossible places, or in any of the units whose work was quiet and is only now being told, I would be honored to hear about it in the comments. What unit, what years, where he ended up when it was over. Those details live in family memory and often nowhere else, and they are worth more than anything in any archive. So how did the Studies and Observations Group actually end? Not with a surrender to an enemy demand. It ended the way most things in that war ended, quietly and politically, on the American timetable. By the early 1970s, the United States was leaving Vietnam, and everyone paying attention understood that the leaving had been decided before the mechanism for it had been fully designed. The policy had a name: Vietnamization. The concept was to transfer the conduct of the war to the South Vietnamese armed forces and bring American personnel home on a schedule that could be presented to a domestic audience as an orderly handoff rather than a retreat. Whatever the presentation, the direction was clear. American involvement was being wound down. The political will to sustain it had eroded past the point of recovery, and the institutions built to fight the war were going to be dismantled in roughly the reverse order of their construction. A deeply secret American command running cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam did not fit the architecture of a country trying to disentangle itself from a war it was publicly committed to ending. The Studies and Observations Group was disbanded on the 30th of April, 1972. Its functions did not vanish the way a unit vanishes when it is defeated in the field. They were folded into a smaller advisory element and passed toward the South Vietnamese. The covert war handed down like everything else being handed down in that period, transferred on a timeline determined in Washington rather than on any battlefield. By the time the disbandment came, William Westmoreland had been gone from the theater for nearly 4 years, moved up to become the Army's Chief of Staff. The unit outlived his command by 4 years, and ended for reasons that had nothing to do with him, and nothing to do with anything Hanoi had demanded at a negotiating table, or through any other channel available to the North Vietnamese government. Here is the forensic verdict, stated plainly, because getting it right is the whole point. The premise that an enemy could demand the disbandment of this command gets the entire shape of the thing backward. The enemy was never the existential threat to the Studies and Observations Group's existence. The enemy could kill its men, and did, in numbers that the unit's classified status kept out of the newspapers and the official casualty counts for years. The enemy could capture its agents, turn them, and run deception operations that fooled American intelligence officers for extended periods, burning networks that had taken years to build. The enemy was capable and inflicted serious damage throughout. What the enemy could not do was reach into the American chain of command and switch the unit off. That switch was never in Hanoi's hands. It was in Washington's, and it had always been in Washington's, and every force that determined whether this command lived, grew, shrank, or was eventually terminated, was on the American side of the equation. The fear of widening the war beyond what domestic politics could sustain. The neutral country treaties the United States had signed and did not want to be caught publicly violating, even while conducting operations that violated them covertly. The memory of China entering Korea when American forces approached the Yalu River. A memory that shaped risk calculations for every senior American commander in Southeast Asia for the duration of the conflict. The politics of a war, losing public support faster than any military success could recover it. The eventual decision, made in Washington for Washington's reasons, to leave. Every one of those was an American hand on the reins. The general who commanded the war spent his years arguing with those hands, pushing for more authority, accepting the limits when the political ceiling came down, and keeping the secret command alive in the narrow space the politicians would permit. The constraint was always from above, never from the enemy. Underscore. There is one sense in which the popular framing of this history is not entirely wrong, and it deserves honest acknowledgement. Hanoi did want these operations stopped. The North Vietnamese understood what the cross-border missions were doing to their supply lines, their agent networks, their ability to move men and material through Laos and Cambodia without harassment from teams they could not reliably find or predict. They denounced the raids. They hunted the recon teams with tracker units specifically trained for the purpose, and they were good at it. Good enough that casualty rates among the teams running the deepest missions were the kind of numbers that would have generated congressional hearings if they had ever been publicly known. They tried captured commandos as criminals rather than prisoners of war. They pressed at the negotiating table for an end to the shadow war being waged against them from across borders that officially existed and practically did not. In that sense, there was a demand, real and sustained and backed by genuine military effort, that the secret war stop. What there was not was the thing the simplified version of this history implies. A single moment where the enemy pointed at a named American unit in front of a named American general and forced a confrontation that produced a specific outcome. The demand was real. The named confrontation is a construction. And the reason the demand could never become that kind of direct reckoning is the same reason the command existed in the form it did throughout its operational life. You cannot be formally handed a bill for a war you have publicly sworn you are not fighting. The denial that allowed the United States to run the Studies and Observations Group was not a detail of the operation. It was the structural condition that made the operation possible. Without it, every cross-border mission was an act of war against a neutral country, or an escalation requiring congressional authorization, or a provocation that might bring Chinese forces into the conflict the way they had come into Korea. The denial held the whole architecture up. And the denial created its own logic, extending in directions the people who built the structure had not fully anticipated. Underscore. A unit that officially does not exist cannot be argued out of existence by an enemy. That is the operational benefit, and it is real. It is also only half the ledger. A unit that officially does not exist cannot be defended in public when questions are asked. It cannot be mourned publicly when its men die. It cannot be made accountable when its operations go wrong, when agents are turned, when the intelligence picture it is working from has been corrupted by an enemy deception running long enough that the corrupted version has become the baseline. It cannot be argued for in congressional testimony the way visible programs can be argued for, which means its continued existence depends entirely on private decisions made by a small number of people in the executive branch, responding to political pressures that have nothing to do with the unit's operational record. It lives entirely inside the government that owns it, at the mercy of that government's fears and shifting calculations. And it dies when that government decides it is done, on a date set in a capital city far from any border the unit ever crossed. The Studies and Observations Group was disbanded, not because it had been beaten in the field, not because Hanoi had successfully demanded its termination, not because the men running it had failed at what they were sent to do. It was disbanded because the American government decided the war it was part of was over, or near enough to over, that the risk of continuing the shadow campaign outweighed whatever the cross-border missions could still produce. That calculation was made in Washington by people managing a withdrawal, not a war, and the unit's fate followed as a consequence. Underscore. There is a lesson in that sequence, and it does not expire with this war or this command. Secrecy is a shield, and it is also a trap, And the same property of the thing makes it both. The shield. The denial that allowed the United States to run operations it could not publicly acknowledge also meant the enemy could not formally challenge those operations through channels available for things that officially exist. You cannot demand accountability for something the other side has committed to denying. The trap. The same denial disowned the prisoners those operations produced, hid the dead those operations cost, and created conditions in which a sophisticated enemy deception could run for years, without the oversight that might have caught it. Because that oversight requires the kind of accountability structure the denial had deliberately foreclosed. The boat had no flag. The men had no names their country would say out loud. And the command that sent them across borders that could not officially be crossed was never going to be ended by the people it was sent against. It was only ever going to be ended by the people who sent it. That is the truer and stranger story, underneath the simpler one. Not a confrontation with a clear antagonist and a resolution tied to a specific moment of external pressure. A government running a secret war inside a larger war, using the secrecy to do what it could not do openly, and shutting the secret war down when the larger war became politically unsustainable, on a timeline set entirely by domestic politics and the limits of American will. The enemy fought well. They adapted, inflicted losses, and pressed through every available channel for the operations to stop. They were not passive. They were not irrelevant. But they were not the ones who threw the switch. The switch was always in Washington. It was only ever going to be thrown by Washington. And when Washington threw it, the command ended not with a confrontation, but with a disbandment order, a date, and the quiet folding of its work into something smaller, handed to other hands, on a timeline the enemy never controlled and never could have. If you've been watching this channel for a while and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.